You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Often, when we consider strange events that occur in the world, be it an encounter with a strange creature, experiencing a paranormal entity, or seeing an unidentified object in the sky, we will wonder how it could change our lives. My guest this week found herself caught in a situation that has made her consider the reality of truth and witness something that changed everything. Caz Clarke has spent years attempting to uncover the truth of what occurred over the village of Pentyrch in Wales back in February 2016. Despite numerous witnesses, explosions that rocked the area and were registered, mysterious groups of people who were seen meticulously searching fields, smashed trees, and a giant pyramid sighted in the sky, the authorities say that nothing happened and everything is misperception. After listening to Caz, you'll probably dispute the official explanations and begin to question the reality of what we're often told. But before that, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up to Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters or click on the link in the show notes. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, early releases, bonus content, and more. A big thank you to Naomi, my latest patron. Welcome to the team. Mysteries and Monsters can be found across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And don't forget, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can also find information, episodes, and merchandise by going to mysteriesandmonsters.com. We seem to have had a run on stickers recently, so thank you to everybody that's found one of those as well. You can click on the links on the website to get your own. As always, thank you to Dean Bestel for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Let's go back to February 2016, and for Caz Clarke and the other witnesses, everything they thought they knew was about to be changed forever. On today's show, we dive into a series of strange incidents that occurred in February 2016 around the village of Pentyrch in Wales over several days. I'm delighted to be joined by the primary eyewitness and author, Caz Clarke. Caz, despite people's best intentions, I am delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. Goodness!
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
As we were joking before we started, in all the shows I've done, Caz, I've never had as many problems trying to get someone online as I have with you in trying to speak to you earlier this evening. So that alone makes me even more intrigued in this incredible case than I was previously.
You know, in every interview I've ever done, here and across the pond, you know, there have always been problems, always, without a doubt.
Well, you're here now, and I'm delighted to finally get a chance to speak with you, Caz. So, for anybody who's unaware of this, as far as I'm aware, Caz, you are a normal person with normal hobbies and a normal outlook on life that somehow, one February evening, was suddenly drawn into a series of strange events that built up until an incredible incident was witnessed not only by yourself but by other people in that area.
That's right.
For anybody who's unaware of what happened, Caz, can you just kind of build it up for us? Because obviously I think some people think it was just the main incident that happened, but obviously having heard you speak previously, I know there's quite a bit of build-up before the main event happened.
Absolutely. And that's what really drew my attention to something was actually going on. You're quite right in saying I was just a normal person. I have family. You know, my biggest concern was what we were going to have for dinner this evening, you know, not UFOs. That was never part of my life. You know, I have to admit, I never dismissed the idea that perhaps they existed, but it wasn't an interest of mine. This started for me on Tuesday, the 23rd of February, 2016. when we had a small grey twin propeller plane flying very low and very slow over the village. And I noticed it, but I didn't really pay it any attention, really. I just remember thinking, if it goes any slower, it's going to fall out of the sky. We have military aircraft that pass through. We have RAF St. Athan about 14 miles away from us. So I wasn't overly concerned at that point. It was the Wednesday morning when David, one of my neighbours, came out of his house and he was cursing until he was red in the face, because this small grey twin propeller plane had kept him awake all night. And it was then that I started to notice the behaviour of this aircraft. And it was flying in circles, very slowly and very low. And that went on all day. And then a short while later, another plane would come and take its place. And then the first plane would leave. The first plane didn't leave, and then another plane would come. It would wait for the second plane to come before it would leave. And all Wednesday night, that was all I could hear. When someone's pointed a sound out to you, that's kind of what you listen out for. And every 15 minutes, that small twin propeller plane was flying over the top of my house. And you kind of had to sit there and anticipate when it's going to come back. And it came back. And then all Wednesday night, that's all I could hear. Going into Thursday morning, it was still there. And the second plane would come back and take the first plane's place, and that would continue. And we had emailed the Ministry of Defence, and we had emailed the mainstream media, and we had not received a reply from either. I mean, had the Ministry of Defence had answered us and said, it's just an exercise, then we wouldn't have been out there watching with them. But everybody ignored us. And because of that, it was quite clear that they were watching for something. David thought perhaps that they were watching for Russian planes. And I know that sounds outrageous, but it was only the week before that our Air Force had turned away 2 Tu-160 Russian bombers from our airspace. So he thought that perhaps that's what they were watching for, that we were going to witness some real-life dogfight or something. I'm not a plane spotter, and I've always said, unless it's a Cessna, I can't really tell you what it is. And I've only recently found out there are multiple kinds of Cessna. So, anyway, Thursday night, we decided as a neighbourhood, it wasn't just me and David, but Donna, one of my other neighbours, and a few others were concerned about this aircraft. And we'd gone into my back garden. We decided that we'd watch with them because clearly they were watching for something. David was quite excited that we were actually going to witness some kind of dogfight. And I'd lit the fire pit, wrapped up warm because it was freezing. And we watched this small grey twin propeller plane, by this time now, starting to fly in figure 8 patterns. So it was actually flying over my house a bit more often than every 15 minutes, more like every 7 or 8 minutes. And it got to about 2 a.m. on Friday, the 26th of February, 2016. And I was freezing cold and I'm a little bit numb. And I said to David, look, nothing's happening. I'm going to go in. And he asked if it was okay for him to stay. And I said, yeah, you stay if you want to, but I'm going to go in. And I walked to the end of my garden. I got my hand literally on the back door handle of my house. And I heard what sounded like a missile. And that's real. That's what it sounded like. So I ran back to the end of my garden where David was still standing just to see this huge plane go over the top of us. I had no idea what it was. We had almost a full moon. It had just ebbed over the full moon. So it was still full, but, just ebbing over. And this plane banked around to the left-hand side. Now, I have to tell you that Pentyrch is in an elevated position. And we can see for miles in every direction but north because that's where the actual mountain is.
Yeah.
And as the plane banked around to the left-hand side, so you could see the outline of this mushroom-shaped object on its back. And David exclaimed immediately, that's an E3 Sentry plane. And I said, well, what's that? He said, I don't know, some kind of command centre in the air. Well, I thought this was a little bit unusual because we don't have E3 sentries in this area. And it started to circle. Not small circles. I mean, this thing took a few minutes just to go around once. And we watched it 7 times. That plane circled. And David said, well, perhaps it's taxiing to the airport. The only airport that's really large enough to accommodate a plane of that size would have been Cardiff International Airport, where you wouldn't expect to see a NATO E3 Sentry plane. Well, on the 7th time that it went around, 1 red light became visible high above the trees behind my house. Now, behind my house is absolutely nothing but farmland that ebbs away from you. And I'd called for Donna, the other neighbour that had been watching with us that night. She'd gone into the house to make us all hot chocolates. I didn't receive an answer. I called again. I still didn't get an answer. So I shouted to David to follow me, and we jumped over the small wire fence and ran to the 5-bar gate that overlooks the farmland behind us to get an unobstructed view as to what was going on. And one red light turned into 3 red lights. That red light didn't split into 3 red lights. It was a triangle, the very pinnacle of what turned out to be a huge pyramid craft. That was the very top of it. It had a leading set of 6 lights on its near side edge, and between each of those bright red lights were smaller, dimmer red lights. But you could see the outline of it. It came in point first on its side with a near side edge facing us. It emerged. It didn't come down from outer space. It emerged through the space, like it came through a black veil into this world. There was no distortion in the air, no sound, no nothing. This thing, it was just lights, if you like, but in this shape of a pyramid. And it was turning very, very slowly anti-clockwise, and as it did so, it came down in a pendulum motion and righted itself in the upright position. This was happening all about 200 yards or 200 meters away from us. It actually came across into the field, adjacent to the field that we were standing, if you like. And once it was in the upright position, it fired a really bright green object out of the top of it. I don't know what shape that was. It was too bright. It actually hurt my eyes to look at it. And this thing moved across to my left-hand side and stopped above a thicket of trees, again about 200 yards away from us, maybe 100, 200 feet up, and just swung there, rocking gently backwards and forwards, not moving anywhere. The pyramid has listed to the right-hand side, and it's still turning very slowly anti-clockwise and moving away from us. And I stood on the 5-bar gate to get a better view through the bare trees, and said to David, it's landing, thinking it was coming down, when in reality the ground there rises, and that is the foot of the Garth Mountain. So the land was coming up to meet it. And as the land got close to it, it ejected what I described as a hand of lightning. But it wasn't thin lightning like we have here. It was thick, fire-coloured fingers, if you like, that came out of the corner, just the very corner of this craft, as if it was trying to stop itself from touching the ground. And the whole thing lit up really brightly, so you could see this was a pyramid. This was not a string of lights or flares or anything else. We've asked the RAF, they didn't use any flares that night. Now, I've looked up, just because I heard 2 military planes coming, just to see these 2 planes go over the top of us, because they were really low, flying wingtip to wingtip. These planes had 2 engines on each wing. I now know them to be 2 C-17s, and they were flying towards where this pyramid was. When I looked back, I couldn't see the pyramid anymore, but that's not to say it wasn't there. I just couldn't see it. David said he saw 15 or 20 objects come out of the top of it. Well, such was the size of it, whilst I was staring at the bottom of it, and I don't know to this day why I was fixated on it touching the ground, but I was. That from 200 yards away or 200 meters away, you couldn't see the top in your peripheral vision. That's how big it was. I didn't see any of those come out the top, and I could sit here and tell you that I did, but that's not true. I didn't see them, but David did. From my left-hand side, 2 C-130s came, 2 Hercules aircraft, gunships. And they too have turned, and they've gone back in behind the 2 C-17s, and they took up the outside wide position. And this green object that's been there the whole time has gone in a completely straight line, really fast, across and in front of these aircraft, and fired 3 really bright strobes at these aircraft, and then appeared, I said, like it appeared to get excited, and it started skipping and bobbing. I described like Tigger off Winnie the Pooh, rather than travelling in a straight line.
Yeah.
As if, I suppose, to draw these aircraft away from the pyramid and the objects that it had jettisoned. I always thought it was a deliberate decoy to draw the aircraft away. The E-3 Sentry was still above us, flying in an oval flight pattern, if you like, above the whole area.
I mean, I have to say, Caz, having seen something strange myself many years ago in the night sky, certainly not to the level of this incident, at that time I was kind of strangely calm about everything that was going on, and it was only sort of the more it happened, the stranger I began to feel. And I would imagine yourself and David, to all intents and purposes, this has gone from watching strange planes flying oddly around the area and awaiting a delivery of a much needed hot chocolate, I suggest, to then suddenly escalate to this absolutely mind-blowing situation. And as you've mentioned there, obviously I'm aware of this. I'm certainly aware of all the excuses that have come forward, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those in a bit. But the fact that both of you had such a clear view of the object, as I said when I saw the object I saw, like I said, I've always said, Caz, I'm not going to tell you what I think it is. I can't tell you, but I certainly know what it wasn't. And I think, as you're referring to there, you are crystal clear in your recollection and your memory of the events of what you weren't seeing.
Absolutely. There was no mistake. This was a pyramid. This was a three-sided pyramid of an enormous size. But it gets better. I watched the green object until I couldn't see it anymore, and that flew off into the distance with the 4 planes behind it. And they took up the entire visible airspace, and they were all bathed in green light. You could see all the outline of all their engines, the fuselages, the whole 4 aircraft. After that had gone, we were approached by 2 barrel-shaped objects. And if David hadn't seen where they came from, I wouldn't have been able to say where they came from. But I know they came out of the pyramid now. They were both towel-like red in colour. They were capped on the top, just with plain black caps. And the insides were moving like electricity. Described it like white noise on a TV screen, but it was more 3D than that. Like it was mixing. They were mixing in on themselves. Like stirring electricity almost, I want to say.
Yeah.
One of them stopped above the hedge, maybe 20 or 30 feet away from me, and about 20 feet up. And I still stood on the gate. And I stared at it just for a few seconds because I wanted the details. I wanted to see, and I'm just sad that there aren't more details. And then I looked to see where the second one was, and that hadn't stopped. And by that time, that was right over the top of us. And the only thing that I could think to do was to wave. And I know that sounds stupid, but with all the military activity going on that night, I didn't want them to think that we were hostile.
Yeah.
And the one above us changed colour from tail-light red to traffic light green. You could see even clearer the insides moving, and I felt it scan me. It was the only thing that I couldn't be tested for when I took a polygraph test, because it was just feeling as opposed to knowing. You know, I didn't know that it scanned me, but that's how it felt.
Yeah.
And it was almost like a hand had reached in and took the fear away from me. And I did hear spoken words, and it was simply tell the world what you witnessed here. And I was too afraid to actually admit that to begin with. I didn't say that because I thought people would think that I was crazy, and I'm not crazy. I took 3 polygraph tests with the leading forensic polygraph examiner in this country, and I passed 3 polygraph tests. And they have to be based on fact, not on what you think, not on what you believe, but what you saw, 100%. And I passed 3 times.
I'm interested in that bit, Caz, where that you say that. So were you feeling afraid or scared of the situation? Because as you say, this feeling came over you. So did you suddenly feel as though you'd been washed in calmness and you were able to sort of deal with the situation in a more balanced way? Because I would imagine this is, with the greatest
exactly
respect.
That.
Yeah, you're thinking, what the hell is going on here?
Well, when I saw the pyramid, I was awestruck. And David and I stood there in complete silence watching this thing. In fact, when we first got to the gate, David had run through the gate and was running into the field, and I called him back. And only because the military were there. If the military weren't there, I'd have probably been with him to run closer.
Yeah.
But yes, once those barrels came over us, and I had that euphoric feeling, it was only at that moment that I reached into my pocket to get my phone out to film this thing. And my phone was completely dead. David's phone's been fried. It won't even switch on. But before that moment, I never thought for a minute to film this thing. Not at all, not ever. In fact, I didn't want to take my eyes away from these things for a single second.
Yeah.
Not for a second. I wanted to see everything. After the barrels went, the green one above us moved away to my right-hand side and lower across the rooftops of the houses. And the one that was still red, that remained sentry the whole time, moved away to my left-hand side and lower across the fields until I couldn't see it anymore. And that's, I don't know if it switched its light off or I just don't know. I just couldn't see it anymore. And we saw the 3 Apache helicopters coming low across the fields from my left-hand side, moving to my right. There was one above two. You could see the red pulsing lights going out in front of them. It was pushing all the grass and the hedges and all the shrubs flat with the force of their rotor blades on an intersection course where the green object, the first green object, had gone.
Yeah.
And we ran around to the front of the houses to get a better look up the valley, but by the time we got there, they'd already gone. David and I walked down to the second field where this pyramid had come in. The E3 sentry was still above us. And this oval flight pattern moved with us. So when I say that it followed us, that's exactly what it did. When we moved down the field, that oval flight pattern moved with us. And when we went back, that oval flight pattern came back and all the way to my home, followed me back to my house. We walked down to the second field where this pyramid came in because David had said he saw 15 or 20 of these objects. So he wanted to see if there were any more.
Yeah.
Because these things weren't hostile. They certainly didn't feel hostile. And they didn't show our military any hostility. In fact, they ran and tried to hide. It was, I've always said, it was almost a full moon. It just ebbed over the full moon. But in the shadow of the hedgerows and the trees, it was pitch black. And we're on a mountain in the middle of the night, and it was wet and slippery underfoot. We didn't have a torch between us or a phone that worked, and it was quite dangerous, so we didn't venture further, if you like. So we walked back to my house, and the E3 sentry followed us. I went in and made us hot drinks, and David sat there. You'd think that we'd be talking frantically about this, but it was the complete opposite. David was almost catatonic, sat there staring into the abyss, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. And I was the opposite. I was energized. I needed to tell someone, anyone in the world that would know what to do with this information, because I was not a member of any UFO groups. I was not a ufologist. I didn't know about this alternative media or anyone that I could speak to about it. Anyway, after we drank our drinks, David went home and I went to my bed. Not that I could sleep. I could still hear all the commotion with the military planes and helicopters, and then I heard the explosion.
Yeah.
This was an enormous explosion. This was a kaboom. This was not a little bang. This was huge from 5 miles away. I know where the explosion was now. It registered on the Richter scale 40 miles away in Monmouthshire. The next morning, or the same morning, I should say, it was still the 26th of February, I woke up to David knocking on my front door about 8 o'clock in the morning, frantically saying, oh, you know, Wells Online have put out a cover story. And I said, what do you mean they've put out a cover story? How military helicopters have kept parts of South Wales awake. Well, I didn't know that you weren't supposed to talk about UFOs. So I immediately launched into a comment and said, you know, I can categorically assure you that what happened last night was no exercise. What I witnessed will stay with me for the rest of my life. And what they were chasing were not planes. You know, and I'd take a lie detector for anyone, anywhere. And I had two people that used fake Facebook profiles. They, one called themselves the Smoking Man, and the other one called themselves Agent Fox Mulder. I kid you not, because they liked their play on words. You know, I think they were just trying to make it seem impossible or trying to ridicule it in their way, you know, because the military were at community level from the off. You know, we had people making one-line comments in all the local hubs, and you've got to be a member of that hub to be able to make a comment. It was the same person throughout all the local hubs in this area. It was a military exercise. That was what they said, just the one-liner. It was a military exercise before anyone knew that it was a military exercise, including the mainstream media. So how did this person know?
Yeah. The thing that strikes me about this, Caz, is clearly what's gone on, regardless of the fact, like you say, I think I've heard you mention that if it wasn't for the fact that there'd been these strange flights for the previous 3 days, you would never have been aware that anything was going on. And I find it very odd that we get to a point where we have a full-scale military exercise, allegedly, going off at 2:30 in the morning in February, where you've got planes and helicopters. I mean, with the greatest of respect, and I presume everybody knows what a helicopter or a plane flying low sounds like, Caz. How on earth did they expect nobody to be paying attention to this? Because I find it incredible, even when we look at down the line, when we've come out with this excuse that it's part of an operation, it was a military exercise. I find it mind-boggling, Caz, that even if that is the real reason, and I highly doubt it is, personally speaking, I find it incredible that they presumed that nobody would pay attention or come out and see what the hell was going on at that time, because if that happened anywhere else, Caz, people would definitely be coming out. It's crazy to try and do something like this and not expect anybody to pay attention.
Most of the noise was in Llantrisant and the surrounding areas there. What we had here was an E3 sentry plane from NATO. There were actually 2 E3 sentries involved that night. Mm-hmm. We had the C-17s and the C-130s fly over, and that was the only aircraft in this area, apart from the small grey twin propeller plane that shot off as soon as the E3 sentry arrived. Most of the noise was in Llantrisant, and it was through the comments that were made on Wells Online that I wanted to go and find out. I wanted to go and see the impact crater. I wanted to know what had happened to this green object. So Llantrisant Common was my starting point at the other end the same morning to find out what had happened. And we'd gone to Llantrisant Common. All the metal that had been on the common for years, you know, old bikes and bits of old car and the fridge over there, you know, have been neatly stacked up along the roadside. Now, this metal's been on the common for at least a decade. But in the early hours of the 26th of February, the military decided to do a meticulous metal search. And when I say meticulous, people have been out there with metal detectors since and haven't even found as much as a bottle top. This was cleared completely. I've spoken to a witness that lives on Llantrisant Common. He told me that troops were coming out of the back of their helicopters using fast ropes. There were choppers flying low over Llantrisant Common with their spotlights on. There was yellow tape tied to bushes and trees across the common, almost as if they were sectioning off areas once it had been searched. We stopped the car and we spoke to 2 people walking their dog there, bearing in mind this is the morning after the night before. If they'd seen anything, if they'd witnessed anything. And they told us that the first explosion was an air explosion. And the second explosion sounded like something hit the ground in Smilog Woods. So because I wasn't from that area, I didn't know where Smilog Woods was located, and felt quite stupid, actually, when they pointed to this enormous wooded hill that rises behind the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. Bearing in mind, this was supposed to have been an exercise. No exercise was listed for this area. You know, Exercise Chameleon was for the week before in Durham, 310 miles away. No mention of South Wales, no mention of low-level flying, especially at night, over a residential area. This was next to the Royal Mint. There is no way in God's earth that they would ever be allowed to do a military exercise next to the Royal Mint. That's not going to happen, especially using explosives. Well, we'd gone to Smilog Woods immediately because I wanted to find the impact crater. And because I knew the trajectory of the green object, I knew roughly where to start looking because, you know, Smilog Woods is an 800-acre wooded mountain, if you like. And it wasn't long before we started to see the branches had been snapped off of the canopies of these trees. We'd fought our way into the woods because there's all brambles and stuff on the outside of it. And we started to follow the debris trail. And soon those small branches turned into bigger branches. And then eventually the canopies were out completely. There are no branches on the bottom parts of the trees. This is Forestry Commission land. And there are only really any branches on maybe the top 12 or 16 foot of the tree. These are 60-foot trees. We walked further and soon these trees were snapped in half. The trunks had exploded. Something had hit these trees with enormous force. And I believe it was that green object. And for every tree that thing hit, it slowed down. So there wasn't a huge impact crater in the ground, but there was an end to this debris trail. We hadn't reached the end of the debris trail before I needed to go. I needed a drink. I needed to go back and tell everybody else what we had found. And so we'd gone back to my home. We spoke to David and Donna, and we decided that we'd go up the very next morning with cameras to follow this debris trail through to its end and find this impact crater. Well, we'd gone over to Stephen, one of my other friends, wanted to go over to where this pyramid came in. So we walked over to a field, and the field where this pyramid emerged, it was snowing in. It wasn't snowing in the surrounding fields. I remember standing on the edge of the field watching the snow fall in front of me, but not on me, like quite childlike, like this is really bizarre. And we've walked around the perimeter of that field. It wasn't snowing anywhere else, just in that one field.
Yeah.
Donna said it felt like something was still there. She was quite spooked by it. But the snow was also unusual in that it resembled a hailstone, but it wasn't hard like a hailstone. It was quite spongy, but it still dissolved, as snow does. But it was also snowing at the crash site the next day, which was the 27th. That was the morning I woke up and my hair was completely white overnight. That's, not shocking enough. I was more excited to go up and find the impact crater.
Yeah.
My hair is visible in the video that we took at the crash site, and you can see my hair is completely white. Now, I'm a little bit salt and pepper down, but, to be completely grey overnight was crazy.
The first incident in itself is remarkable, but then I've seen the footage of the trees and what's gone on in the woods, Caz, and it's very clear that something's hit that. It's beyond explanation. It's plain. It's as obvious as the nose on your face, Caz.
Yeah.
I remember hearing somebody saying, "Oh well, it was a weather phenomenon. There was high winds that night." Now I'm pretty sure that you guys would have checked that out and found that was absolute nonsense. There was no high winds recorded.
Nonsense. Yeah, we've actually put it in the book, the whole weather for the entire week, and I think the strongest wind speed was 7 miles an hour. It's almost an impossibility to snap a tree mid-trunk.
Yes.
In a storm, a tree will uproot before it snaps.
Yeah.
I've never seen trees 12 and 14-inch thick trunks snapped in half. 60-foot trees cleanly snapped in half. The Forestry Commission felled the trees that were damaged through the debris trail. Their excuse was that it was larch disease. And that would be, for the layman, a good excuse as to why they felled those trees. And they went on to tell us that they'd received a plant health notice to do that. So rather than ask them, we went to their management strategy for larch disease, for their own reports to see that have all of the plant health notices for Wales, for larch disease, and not one has been placed on Smarlog Woods. Plus, they're not allowed to fell the trees in wintertime. They can only fell the trees between the 30th of June and I believe it's 31st of August. There's quite a short time span that they can actually fell diseased trees because there's no way to tell if a defoliated tree has larch disease or not. And they actually circumvented their own biosecurity by felling the trees in December and January, which they're not allowed to do under their own felling licenses. So that's a lie. We asked the Ministry of Defence what was the cause of the explosion. And they told us that it was a simulated munition. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen a simulated munition, but I've seen more smoke and more noise from a firework than I have from one of these simulated munitions. And a simulated munition has no kinetic energy. So it wouldn't have been powerful enough to have shaken the Royal Glamorgan Hospital, physically shaken patients awake in their beds, shaken people's homes and shook people awake in their homes, and set car alarms off in the neighbouring villages.
Yeah.
So not just in Llantrisant, but in the neighbouring villages, in Bader and Talbot Green, the car alarms were going off because this kinetic wave was enormous. And what we believe happened was that one of the Apache helicopters fired a missile that night at this green object and was caught in its own kinetic wave. It had to do a full-scale emergency landing at Cardiff International Airport with its cockpit on fire. This was no small scale. This was a full-scale emergency, what you wouldn't expect to see an Apache helicopter at Cardiff International Airport. The smoke was so dense, falling from the air, and this has come from members of staff at the Royal Glamorgan Hospital, that it resembled a foggy night. And not only that, was so dense, it was coming through the vents and through the windows and filling the corridors of the hospital with smoke. The hospital received a telephone call. The explosion went off at 4:21 a.m. The hospital received a telephone call at 4:30 a.m. and was told that their services were not required. The Ministry of Defence closed off all of the footpaths and all of the roads, and so did uniformed police close the roads. No one had permission to do that. No one had permission to close the roads or the footpaths into Smilock Woods, but they did. We asked, one lady was trying to get back from Aberystwyth to Merthyr. Normally would take her about half an hour to drive. 3 hours later, she's still on the road because every road she had tried to get home on was closed by uniformed police. They had told her that a truck had overturned, and it was only on the last road that she tried. She said, well, it's an awfully big truck that can close all of the mountain roads. When we asked South Wales Police, why did they close the roads? It took them 3 years to answer us on a Freedom of Information request where they're required by law to answer within 20 days. 3 years later, this was the excuse, that they could find no information regarding road closures that night, but the police officers involved have since left the organisation. Well, if they can't find any information, how the hell do they know who was involved? Okay. We asked the Ministry of Defence, why did they do a meticulous metal search on Llantrisant Common in the early hours? You know, this is 4:30 a.m. in the morning. People have to get up for work the next day. Bearing in mind that no one knew anything. The hospital didn't know, the Royal Mint didn't know, general public didn't know, the mainstream media didn't know. If this was an exercise, the mainstream media would have known. Yeah. Why couldn't it have waited until the daylight hours? And we were told Section 26, not in the public interest. Well, shortly after the event, we had some very strange men and women come and camp in the fields here. I've been here 20 years. I've never had people camp in the fields before or since. So I asked Gary if he would ask the local government whether or not there'd been any planning applications for a change of use of the land, just to cut them off, really, and close the door on them for them to be able to change records, let's put it that way. Yeah. So we gave them a full 2 years. You know, have there been any planning applications for a campsite or for a survey in those fields? Came back with nothing. I didn't know they were there initially. I only found out from my local Pentyrch hub, because they were camped behind the thicket of trees on my left-hand side. But from my house, you can't see them. You actually have to go into the field to be able to see them. And local residents have been told different stories as to who these people were. The first story was that they were a fracking survey team. Well, that didn't go down well in the village at all. And somebody else had been told that they were Vodafone doing field research. So, okay, that tweaked my curiosity, and I wanted to go over and see who these people were. I didn't want to go alone, so Stephen, my friend, has come over, and we've taken my dog out under the guise of taking my dog for a walk. Yep. And as we've got to the gateway, so we have seen two soldiers coming towards us. They were wearing full digital camouflage. They looked identical, same boots, everything. And they were both carrying the identical weapon. These guns did not have yellow caps in the end of them. They had magazines, and they didn't look like they'd been dragged around on exercise anywhere. These guns looked shiny and brand new. And one soldier, he had a very middle-class English Etonian accent, said, "Oh, we're doing a military exercise in case of an emergency situation if you see anything funny going on in the fields down there." And I said, "Well, you need guns for that, do you?" He said, "Yes, we do." I said, "Well, why are you hiding them?" Because they were trying to wrap them up in their jacket. Yeah. "Oh, we don't want to upset the locals." I thought, well, who am I? I'm a local. Anyway, we'd walked down the track and into the field where they were camped. And I said, you can take the man out of the army, but you can't take the army out of the man. You couldn't get your foot between these tents. You know, the drawstrings on them were identical. Yeah. You know, they weren't haphazard like you or I would set up a campsite, you know, watch the trip lines, you know. This was perfect. Yeah. So initially we started to walk around the outside of the field, and I said to Stephen, I'll stop this, I want to get closer. So we cut across the field through that midway point, if you like. And a huge dog that I now know to be some kind of pit bull type breed, it was massive, it's nearly as big as me, came charging out of one of the tents towards us. So I asked Stephen to pick my dog up because I didn't want her to get bitten. Mm-hmm. And this dog started to circle her. And I could see two men in camp. One was seated and one was standing in this green canvas open-fronted tent. And I shouted at them, "You're no country boys, are you? This is nearly lambing season. You need to put your dog on a lead. You know, the farmer's got a shotgun. He's not afraid to use it." Mm. So with that, this guy's called his dog, has gone back instantly. And I heard "what," which was my in, if you like. So I've walked up the middle of their campsite and I've taken a couple of photographs as I've done so. And the guy seated was about 60 years old, had grey, silver hair, in a DA type style. And he was operating what looked like a laptop, but it wasn't a laptop. It was about 1.5 size, maybe 2 times the length of a laptop in a metal case. He used 2 hands to close the lid of this metal case. He really didn't want me to see what he was doing. He was wearing gold-rimmed half-moon glasses, and I asked them who they were. And their reply was, well, who am I? And I said, well, I'm a local resident. So I asked again who they were, and they told me that they were Vodafone doing field research. Well, they didn't want to speak to me. They didn't, volunteer any more information. So Stephen and I have walked away, and as we were coming back, Donna's come out of her house and said, well, who are they? And I said, well, they said that they were Vodafone, but within 10 minutes, we've been told 2 different stories. They were either doing a military exercise in case of an emergency situation, or they were Vodafone doing field research. So Donna's grabbed my dog and she's taken her out again. This time, Donna's gone the extra yard, shall we say, and she's gone down to the fields. They were wearing white forensic suits and those blue cover shoes in the field where the pyramid came in. Nowhere else, just on their hands and knees, in that field wearing white forensic suits. They also had one of those large laptop-type devices, but it wasn't a laptop. Every time anybody would go near them or walked past, every single one of them would stand up and stop what they were doing and stare at you until you were out of sight. It was really strange and really spooky, and they really didn't behave like civilians at all. At the end of the trail, there's a disused quarry, and they had a Jeep parked there. And Donna's gone around and through the woods, through a garlic field and round and underneath them, because the road for the quarry is lower than the end of the trail, so she was able to get round and underneath them. And she said they had another one of those laptop-type devices and a very small, like, satellite dish on 3 legs, just on the Jeep with it. And she could hear what the men and the women were saying in the fields. They were looking for something, hurry up, find it, whatever it was, they were looking for something. The people wearing forensic suits did carry something away in a bag, I don't know what, but they kept looking behind themselves because Donna kept trying to get a photograph of them. It was almost like they knew that she was there. Yeah. And every time she's kind of popped up, they turned around. So every few steps, they'd turn back and look behind them. Yeah. So later that night, we decided, I'd called a couple of people that I'd spoken to about this case. I said, you need to come down and check these people out because this is really weird. As if everything else wasn't weird enough, Yes, yeah. And Stephen had come over and he thought he had a night vision camera. So we'd gone through the gate and set up the night vision camera, and there was Mike and his son Adam were there, Stephen and myself. I could see the one guy walking around in camp, the one that was standing up, the one that had the dog earlier. And he was snapping those glow sticks and putting them at night lights, if you like, putting them around the campsite. Yeah. And he saw us and he came over and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, we're sky watching. Are you here because of the UFO? He said, oh, no, we don't know anything about that. But he didn't ask anything about it either, and I thought that was highly suspicious. He said he was security for the camp. So for the benefit of the people that were there, that were not there earlier in the day, I asked them what they were doing, wearing forensic suits, searching the field. So he said, bearing in mind that they told us they were Vodafone, we're looking for mock mines. I said, well, do you often send civilians to look for mines wearing paper suits? I said, because that's a sure bloody way to find them. Well, he didn't have a sense of humour. Anyway, it wasn't long before the rest of the camp came back. I don't know where they were, whether or not they'd been out being debriefed somewhere, but he's opened the gate to let them in through with all their jeeps and vans and things. And they've all gone back to the campsite. A few moments later, he's come back and said, well, will you be here for long? I said, well, we'll be here for as long as the sky is clear. And he said, well, my commanding officer is not going to like that. So I've looked at Stephen and I said, I didn't know Vodafone had a commanding officer. And we laughed. He said, well, he's got to want to speak to you. And I said, well, fine. I said, go and get him. I'll speak with him. So he's gone back to the camp and he's come back with quite an angry, broad, stocky man. And he said, have you got permission to be here? You're trespassing. I said, I don't need permission to be here. That's the public footpath. And then he's pointed at the public footpath and got a bit more animated. He said, no, that's a public footpath. I said, are you joking? I said, that's like 12 feet away. The only thing the country code desires me to do is take my rubbish home.
Yeah.
So then he asked me for identification. I said, I don't have to show you anything. And this is the moment that I realised I had post-traumatic stress, because I didn't know. Because when it's happening to you, you're the last person to know.
Yeah.
And I literally flew off the handle, and I went from 0 to 100. I said, we fought 2 world wars, we'd have the right to be free. I said, as long as we're not breaking the law or hurting anybody, I said, we've got a goddamn right to be here. I said, I remember the fascist war movies where they come on the train and ask you for your papers. I said, well, I don't have to show you nothing. But he looked at me, and the only words that came out of his mouth was, I admire your passion. I said, passion? I said, it's my right as a free human being. He didn't say another word of that. He looked at the other guy that came over with him, and he's kind of indicated for them to go back to the campsite, but he didn't say anything after that. But that was the moment I realised I had PTSD.
Yeah. How many people were in this camp then, Caz? Because obviously I've seen a couple of the pictures. There's a lot of tents. How many sort of tents and people were there? Because with the greatest respect, whatever's going on here, this wasn't just a couple of people. There seemed, from the images I've seen of the tents and people in the suits and things, Caz, there seems to be quite a considerable number of people. Did you have a rough idea how many were there?
If I had to put a figure on it, I'd say about 20, roughly. But we asked the Ministry of Defence who were the people in the fields in Pentyrch, and they told us that they held no information within the scope of our request. This is on freedom of information. It's there for the public record. Mm-hmm. So we asked them what they were doing in the fields of Pentyrch, and we were told Section 26, not in the public interest. Only the military can hide behind Section 26. Okay? So if this wasn't, and no exercise has ever been listed for those people that were here. No permission was ever granted for any change of use of the land. Nothing. So because there was no exercise listed, this means this was a covert operation. And if this was covert, this was real. And what could warrant 20 people being armed where my kids play in secret?
Do you think, Caz, because the one thing that strikes me about this is it's the fact that we have these differing explanations, we have these incidents that basically are saying that people who have experienced them are lying, that they didn't run across police barricading roads, that they didn't see people, that, you know, as we've referred to earlier, these people were working for Vodafone, which I find extremely pushing the bounds of credulity at the very best, Caz, to be honest. I think the more you look into this, I think it's the fact that there is this kind of facade of, it's almost as if the fact that they've been so unhelpful kind of leads you into the direction that something strange definitely has happened. Whereas I think, with the greatest respect, Caz, you and I, if we try to get information from the MOD, they don't really owe us anything. But I think if you've got strange things allegedly being sighted in the sky and things being seen and eyewitnesses such as yourself and the others that witnessed and heard everything, you would think that it would be better for them to make it go away, to try and be as helpful as possible.
No, it took the RAF 38 months to admit that the 2 aircraft that were here circling for 3 days and 3 nights continuously were here at all. And when they did, they had a Section 26 not in the public interest. The Ministry of Defence denied those planes were here. They won't lie about it. No exercise was ever listed for them. That is a fact. No terms were ever issued for them. That's a fact. No exercise was listed for the men and women that came and camped in the fields here, covertly. But they were military, and that's a fact. We asked them why they lied about their identity if this was just a military exercise. Again, we had a Section 26 not in the public interest. But they didn't deny they lied. So why did they lie?
Yeah. At what point, Caz, did you begin to think something strange had gone on? You know, and I don't wish that to sound churlish, because obviously what you witnessed, what you've seen, the behaviour of strangers in the locality. I would imagine it gets to a point where you begin to think, am I going mad here? Or is everybody just not taking this seriously? Because I find it absolutely incredible that everything that I've seen from official channels and certain media outlets is basically saying that all the witnesses have no idea what they were witnessed, they're all wrong, you're all mistaken, you've all no idea what you're talking about. I would imagine that is the most frustrating and upsetting thing that you could possibly find yourself as part of.
I think since I've been involved in the UFO community, it has shocked and appalled me that some people that call themselves ufologists and researchers are actively trying to cover this up. The UFO community has been infiltrated by debunkers and trolls. They are holding on to information that can blow the lid off this case. They have photographic evidence and are refusing to give me access to that. I have copies that I've been refused, and Gary has been refused, the originals, for scrutiny, because all evidence is checked and double-checked. The book is a presentation of the evidence and the lies and contradictions that we have been told by the authorities. It's not a story. Why is it that people that call themselves ufologists, that so-called want disclosure, are holding back information that proves this case? Mm-hmm. That's what's frustrating. Yeah. And it all comes from one particular group and their associates, and that is sickening.
Mm. I think it's something, in my experience, Caz, I've spoken to some of the most notable UFO witnesses in the world, and I've always, before I started this show, Caz, I've always had a long interest in this subject. It's something, not just ufology, but the world in general and mysteries about it, and my show covers all kinds of aspects of it, from cryptozoology to the paranormal. And it is very interesting that sometimes it seems that people such as yourself, Caz, are seen as collateral because you're part of a story that they want to be the main driver of. It's their story, regardless of the fact that it happened to you and your neighbours, Caz. You're irrelevant as far as they're concerned because they want to be the story.
This is what happened, I think. I discovered that they were actually writing a book on my incident, and I was approached by two publishers and told me that is exactly what they were doing. And so Gary and I put the evidence down because we didn't want it to be corrupted. Yep. We wanted it there for everyone to see, and all the freedom of information requests are in there, including their reference numbers and dates are on there, so anybody can go on the internet and check this out under whatdotheyknow.com, and it will come up and you can read it for yourself, their responses. I think there is some jealousy involved. I think it's horrific that they're holding on to information that can prove this case. And then Gary and I had some meetings with some MPs, and they asked for the original photographs to be sent. This was to get questions asked in Parliament about this. This is no small task. And we were refused by that group for the originals. I've posted copies of the photographs that have the metadata on them, but they're only copies, so they can't be scrutinised. I did post them once I had permission to do so, and then when we were refused the original photographs, I took them down again because I want to be able to authenticate them. Yeah. And then I was told I wasn't qualified to authenticate them. I wouldn't be doing it. I would get somebody who does photography, who knows photography, to look at it. If I was going to look at a map, I'd get a topographer, surveyor to look at it. I wouldn't do it myself. Mm-hmm. This is the point. But the fact that they have this information, that they have seen a video that exists, they've watched that video, they know this case is real, and yet they're withholding it. What's the point?
Is that the chap that filmed the pyramid flying over them?
Yes.
I mean, I can't get my head round why anybody would want to suppress that unless there was a real appetite to be party to misinformation.
There's been a lot of misinformation by this particular group. They tried to put, shall we say, a spanner in the works multiple times. Shortly after the events here in February, the police did a counter-terrorism drill in June of the same year. using some disused warehouses in Llantrisant, just adjacent to Llantrisant Common. And everybody was sent a letter to say when they'd be doing this, you know. And I think they hope that people's memories will fade, and when they look back at an exercise or a police counter-terrorism drill in that area, they would think, oh yes, we had notification. But they deliberately tried to merge the two incidents to be together as one.
Yes.
You know, they deliberately tried to say that there would be helicopters and aircraft and people would definitely notice it, etc. And Mr. Richard D. Hall actually went out and filmed the police counter-terrorism drill, letting off their fake incendiary devices and firing their blank ammunition. But there were no helicopters, there were no aircraft on that day. But if you ask any of the officials about it now, they will try and merge the two incidents together as one, which is not true. They've tried to do so much backfilling. I mean, no official governing body or emergency service had any prior notification of this military exercise, because it wasn't an exercise. They exceeded the NOTAM, a notice to airmen. In an exercise, they would never exceed that NOTAM, ever, for one reason, for fear of accidents. And there was an accident that night. That Apache helicopter had to do an emergency landing at Cardiff International Airport. You know, Chinook helicopters flying backwards and forwards from Smarlock Woods to St. Athan, being escorted by two Apache helicopters now, two of our best gunships. They are tanks in the air, that's what they are.
Yeah.
What was so important, that what they were carrying, that they had to be escorted by two Apache gunships. They had 20 military helicopters in the air, two E-3 Sentries, C-17s, C-130s, fast jets, not including the J-2 lifter they had on standby, and all at the same time. This was not an exercise. They had enough firepower up there to have taken over a small country, you know, and they would never have done this next to a hospital, over a civilian area, next to the Royal Mint, in the early hours of the morning.
Yeah.
You know, the latest excuse is, well, the military are running out of spaces to practice. 30 miles away as the crow flies from Llantrisant is Sennybridge. 240,000 hectares of land where they can use live ammunition, and they're telling me that they haven't got enough room to train. We asked them why they use this area, or special land features. Yes, special land features, because general public lived there, people in their homes that had to get up for work the next morning after having a sleepless night. People phoning the police because their livestock were being worried because they hadn't been told anything. People's children were woken up in the middle of the night by these helicopters hovering low over their homes. One person said they looked out their bedroom window and they could see the pilot looking back at them. This is how low these aircraft were.
Goodness.
You know, I think they hovered low over people's homes to hide the sound of the explosion. I really do.
Hey.
But they exceeded NOTAM by over 50 miles that night.
Yeah.
We've got witnesses in Port Talbot. We've got witnesses in Neath. We've got witnesses in Bettis and Bridgend. We've got witnesses in Swansea and Gowerton, going all the way out to sea, 50 miles outside the NOTAM.
Yeah.
They would never do it.
Yeah.
But they did that night.
It's interesting to me, Caz, as well, when there are a couple of other famous cases in Welsh UFO history, has anything else come to light that was occurring beforehand or since? Because often I think there are three notable incidents. This is one of the three that I would put as the most compelling UFO incidents in Welsh history, personally speaking. You've got the incident at the Berwyn Mountains in the 1970s, which I saw laughably explained away as a drunk man in a golf cart, which I found remarkable, and once again completely disregards the dozens of witnesses that heard and saw strange things that night. You've got the Broadhaven school incident that happened in 1977, and that people always try to make out was an isolated incident. But when you look at the area around that period, there were notable and numerous witnesses who had a variety of sightings, encounters, some pretty creepy, with people claiming that silver-suited beings were staring through their windows and cows were being moved acres to different farms, and people just didn't understand what the hell was going on there, Caz.
We still have objects that are seen flying around here, nothing as majestic perhaps as what happened that night, and not include it doesn't involve the military.
Mm.
But we do have objects that seem to be flying in and out of our dimension, for want of a better word, here, that have been filmed since the event. I don't know what happened before the event because I was never interested, but now I am. And so in the last 5 years, there's been quite a lot that have been photographed and filmed in this area by myself and others that are on the website for people to see. The iStar project that Gary Jones outed, shall we say, during his investigation, which involved the E3 Sentry and the two smaller reconnaissance and surveillance aircraft. We now know that the military are monitoring for a frequency. And this frequency is listened for, shall we say, using the satellites, which is why the satellites are so important, which is why the military were triangulating one into this area. And this particular frequency is being directed to the E3 Sentry, which is sent out to the smaller reconnaissance and surveillance aircraft to pinpoint, shall we say, or listen for this frequency to see where it's stronger. That was called iStar. It's now been shelved, I believe, here. They're using fast jets instead to go out and intercept these crafts, but they know when they're coming. And I think it was Ross Coulthard that leaked that information and quite recently, because the biggest question was, how did the military know that they were coming here? And that's how.
Well, clearly, I think when you look at what you and your neighbours were witnessing, it clearly seemed that they were expecting something to happen, Caz, which is what gives this incident a really different slant to some very famous cases, especially here in the UK. Normally, the military or the emergency services are usually chasing the situation, whereas here, it seems like they were prepared for it. They just didn't know when it was going to happen.
Yeah, they had it down to, I think, 3 days that they knew it was coming. So how long in advance did they know it was coming? But they watched for it for 3 days and 3 nights continuously before it emerged, because, as I said before, this thing did not come down from outer space. This thing emerged through the space.
Yeah.
And believe me, when you see a pyramid in the sky, you know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
When this thing lit up really brightly, it lit up so much around the brightest lights, it actually illuminated parts of the side of the ship. You could see it was a solid craft. This was not a string of lights. This was not parachutists with flares on their ankles. There was no smoke. It was, we walked down. There were no soldiers here until afterwards. And that was a few days afterwards. They came and camped here. And then they denied that they were soldiers, even though they were carrying guns.
Yeah. Has anybody else come forward, Caz, since to kind of, not to sort of prove you right, Caz, but I think often when we have incidents, as I mentioned there about Broadhaven School as a prime example, that often incidents like this, Caz, are put forward as an isolated incident or a misperception of events. And yet, we're talking several people that witnessed this from across not just Pentyrch, in neighbouring villages and towns who saw things, witnessed things, the explosions that went on, the noises that awoke people, the car alarms going off, the fact that it registered on a seismic monitor. Right.
We have a witness in Pontyclean that's come forward that saw a streak of light, actually, a red light go into the woods, and the whole woods light up that night. That was the impact. We have another witness that says that he has seen videos from a person that filmed it that night in Llantrisant that was working nights there, who's not a ufologist and still hasn't come to terms with what he saw. There are other witnesses. One lady has posted a comment, actually, on YouTube and said that she saw this bright object go past her window, her bedroom window, down to the ground, and then shortly after that the helicopters came in chasing it. She contacted the police to say, have we lost an aircraft, because she thought an aircraft had crashed. And they got back to her and said, no aircraft has crashed. Now she doesn't know what it is that she saw, but this like a gold egg type thing had gone past her window. She thought it was an aircraft on fire. So yes, more people are coming forward. There's hundreds of people that heard and felt the explosions, and yet the police only released 6 transcripts of the calls that night, even though hundreds of people rang in, because nobody knew anything.
How do you feel about what happened now, Caz, based on your interest and knowledge of the subject prior to that February night compared to where you are 6 years later, I would imagine that as someone that came into this whole subject cold, as it were, Caz, that you may have had a passing knowledge of certain things about UFOs or the disclosure movement or something like that.
Yeah.
Going through something like this, I would imagine, and as you refer to, you unfortunately suffer from PTSD and obviously the stress and frustration that came along with it. Are you feeling more comfortable about what happened and how you are now?
Not really. And I say that because, this has challenged everything I thought I knew and believed. Now I know they've lied to us, And I have been contacted via my Facebook page by a few people that have had an interest in the case, and I've agreed to show them where it happened, which I've done.
Mm-hmm.
I've been slated because I've never filmed or recorded these people, and I believe people have a right to anonymity. If they don't want to be filmed, they shouldn't be, or recorded.
Yep.
And there's one gentleman who contacted me and said he had an interest in the case, and he came out, and he turned out to be military. And that's when I decided that I would come forward. I didn't want to come forward. I was outed, if you like, I was threatened with perhaps a fatal car accident, but that accident would extend to my family and my children. And that's when I decided enough was enough.
Yeah.
This is not a story. If I had this much of an imagination to have made this story up, I would have written a book and posted it under fiction.
Yeah.
And not have subjected myself to the attacks by people that are supposed to be wanting disclosure in this country. And they don't. They're there to try and smother the truth. And the fact that they do this to me, just one primary witness, and I'm not the only witness,
yes,
but I am the only one that has spoken out. David has his own reasons, and I understand them completely. There's a guy called Michael in the village also, and he has his reasons, which are more professional, shall I say.
Yeah.
But he was closer than we were. So I am not the only witness by a long shot. But if these people that are in the UFO community attack primary witnesses, I can quite understand why nobody else wants to come forward. But I wish that they would come forward to me, anonymously or through a third party. You can come through confidentially on the website, which is the pentyrchincident.co.uk or .com. Not to misspell it, make sure you spell it right, because there are some fake websites out there that try and collect money in my name, and it has absolutely nothing to do with me. I don't collect donations at all. The book is non-profit. It's absolutely free. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can get access to the book for free. It doesn't cost anything.
Yeah.
But I want people to read it. I want people to be my judge and jury. Look at the evidence. I don't ask people to believe me. I'm here to inform people. This happened and this was real. And it's high time that our government, I think the Pentagon have done the right thing by at least admitting that these things are real.
Yeah.
But from what I can ascertain, our military have been shooting on bringing these things down for the best part of 30, possibly 40 years. What have our military done that warrants us now having to have an armed Space Force? Because it's not just America. We're linked with America and their Space Force. France have their own armed Space Force. So how deep are we in? Are we just going to be left in the dark like mushrooms until something happens?
Yeah.
Because I think we have a right to know. The last time I looked, this planet belongs to all of us. We are one race, we are one planet, and within the UFO community, we should have one goal: disclosure. Regardless as to what people think about me personally, I think I have been particularly difficult. I'm the first person to put my hands up to that. I had the fight or flight mentality with my emotions were all over the place. I was shocked, completely shocked. So when I discovered that I'd been betrayed, I shut them down. Yeah. And, you can't trust someone if they're going to betray you. So this is the point where I am, I suppose, that I'm in this catch-22 situation. I need them, and yet they're all about denouncing and denying. And that's wrong. No matter how you look at it, from whichever side you look at it, it's wrong.
Absolutely. Well, Caz, whenever I've spoken to anybody that's had an experience such as yourself, and some even more full on, not that I'm sort of trying to grade your experience or what you've said. I find people such as yourself quite brave, Caz, because as you've referred to there, you simply open yourselves up to all kinds of ridicule, regardless, from complete strangers to people who you hope are there to assist you. I've nothing but a great deal of respect for anybody such as yourself, Caz, who has been brave enough to put themselves out there and be open and honest and say, this is my story, here I am, and I don't really care if you think I'm making it all up because I know where I saw.
Yeah.
All power to you, and I recommend anybody gets a copy of the book because it is a fascinating account. Yourself and Gary have built a very compelling case. The numerous contradictions from the authorities simply add fuel to the fire. And as you say, your website as well is there for anybody else who may have some additional information. So,
yeah, the website is more than that. One of the things that Gary and I have set up on the website is not just a safe space for witnesses, but there's a place for people if they need counselling or hypnotic regression or help with a situation, an experience that they've had. We have professional counsellors and doctors on standby to help them for free. It is fully confidential. The Pentyrch Instant Team is just a gateway to put you in contact with those people. No third-party information is ever passed. It is 100% confidential because I don't want other people to be in the situation that I was in, where I found myself suffering with PTSD and not having anyone to speak to about it. So that's there as well. It's not just, a website to show people the videos or the photographs of the objects that have been taken here, or just a safe space for witnesses, because that's there as well. We don't need your name. If you want to come through as Mickey Mouse, please do. We just need to know what you saw that night. And even if you think it's irrelevant or it's not really going to make a difference, just having someone come forward and telling us about all the car alarms going off, that was huge for us because it proves the kinetic wave. So no matter how small or insignificant you might think that your information is, it's not. Every little helps.
Absolutely. Well, Caz, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. You're someone I've wanted to speak to for a very long time, and I appreciate after everything you've been through that you're still willing and honest enough to invite me into your evening for a conversation about your experience, and I thank you once again for your time and your most enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.